After years of being together, my ex left me burdened with absurd amounts of debt. When he returned, begging for help, my name is Caroline, and for a long time I believed in the idea of unconditional love, thinking that such a feeling would be my safe haven. But reality turned out to be harsh and treacherous. For years, I lived in an illusion, where empty promises and Edward's fraudulent plans, this was the man I thought shared my dreams and life projects, ended up dragging me into an emotional and financial abyss. When I realized that my trust had transformed into a crushing debt of $150,000, every bank statement, every payment notice, and even the slightest crack in the silence of our everyday commitments began to erode the fragile wood of our relationship, leaving deep marks that reflected his irresponsible actions and the magnitude of his disregard. It was months of inner battles, sleepless nights, and a mounting sense of trauma with every passing day, as the pressure to meet unsustainable financial obligations mixed with the anguish of having been deceived by the one to whom I had entrusted part of my very soul. In the midst of this turmoil, I found unwavering support in my sister, Renee. With her empathy and quiet strength, she became the safe shoulder on which I could vent and question what seemed to be the inevitable fate drawn by a love that proved to be nothing more than an illusion. Equally important was the support of my longtime friend, Sophia, whose integrity and clear-sightedness helped me see, through meticulously organized papers and records, that Edward's trajectory would not go unpunished. I then decided to turn the disillusionment into a process of personal rebuilding, documenting every misappropriated dollar, every contract, and every transaction that proved the manipulation which had perpetuated the cycle of debt and deceit. This accumulation of evidence wasn't just a legal tool, but a symbolic weapon against the past, a means to reaffirm that control over my own life belonged solely to me. When months after the separation, Edward reappeared, pleading for help, and trying to salvage the fragments of a lost love, I felt a mix of resentment and relief. His desperate requests, unable to hide the irresponsibility that had led him there, were met with a calm that only overcoming hardship and maturing can bring. I confronted him not with the intent to rekindle something that should never have existed, but to clarify, based on indisputable proof, that every cent of the debt and every mistake he made was a painful, yet liberating reminder that I wasn't obligated to carry the burden of his choices. During our encounter, our conversation unfolded into an exchange of unspoken truths from our relationship and a silent confrontation with a past that had taught me the value of self-love and independence. With a firm and resolute stance, I declared that I would never allow myself to be subjugated again by someone who, through irresponsible actions, tried to damage not only my present, but also the future I was painstakingly rebuilding. This attitude symbolized the turning point in my story, where pain transformed into learning, and past mistakes were seen as essential lessons in the construction of a new identity. By refusing to help and turning down any attempts at reconciliation, I realized that true revenge isn't in retaliating or returning harm, but in thriving and building a life based on freedom, justice, and self-reliance. Every document, every bank record, every signature that verified the damage Edward caused became undeniable proof that I could not allow someone else's error to define my path. This process of organization and investigation, carried out with rigor and determination, not only revealed the fragility of a toxic relationship, but also reinforced the necessity of preserving one's own history, ensuring that the scars of the past make way for the strength that propels every new step. Thus, while Edward wallowed in his own guilt and anguish, I moved forward, raising truth as an impenetrable shield and justice as the banner that symbolized the conquest of my independence. Today, with every new achievement and every challenge overcome, I reaffirm that true liberation comes from self-awareness and the courage to transform suffering into fuel for renewal. This experience, full of trials and intense emotions, taught me that allowing yourself to love again doesn't mean returning to the past, but rather forging a new path where every obstacle turns into an opportunity for growth and every defeat becomes a stepping stone toward a fulfilling life, a life where no one can dictate the contours of my destiny. Overcoming that painful chapter redefined me, proving that even after being dragged to the bottom by a love that turned out to be as illusory as it was treacherous, true victory lies in taking control of one's own story. Every cost paid, every tear shed, and every battle fought served to confirm that the process of healing and rebirth is continuous, and that hope, even when it seems dim for a while, always resurfaces stronger, allowing the true worth of a woman to be measured not by a past marred by mistakes and debt, but by the lessons that propel her forward with unshakable dignity and self-love. Perhaps the most ironic part of the story is how Edward managed to surprise me twice. First by leaving me with a mountain of debt, and then by thinking I would be naive enough to believe in his belated remorse. When he sent that cold text message, ending our 7-year relationship with a simple, "I need some time," I should have known that men like him never have the courage to face the consequences of their actions. It's almost comical to think that such a brief message carried so much weight, as if it could sum up years of living together, shared plans, and promises made in just 5 words typed between meetings, probably while he was already planning his next move, far from the responsibilities he had created. I remember the day I discovered the extent of the damage. It was an ordinary Tuesday, and while reviewing my monthly bills, I noticed an unfamiliar charge. One charge after another piled up until I found myself tangled in a labyrinth of statements and invoices that revealed a systematic pattern of fraud. Edward had used my name, my personal information, and my trust to finance a lifestyle that, ironically, didn't even include our shared life. How did I not see it before? Was the question that pounded in my mind as I cataloged every new document that arrived. Loans for businesses that never existed, financing for ghost equipment, credit cards with outrageous limits maxed out during nights spent working late. The story he sold me was too perfect to be questioned. Or maybe I was too blind to see beyond the smoke and mirrors he created. The day I confronted Edward with the evidence was surreal. As I methodically laid out each fraudulent transaction and every lie unmasked, he sat there with a vacant look oscillating between shame and calculation. There were no screams, no dramatic tears, not from me at least. There was something almost clinical in the way I dismantled his house of cards, revealing the rotten structure that had supported our relationship. "You don't understand, Caroline. I did it for us," he tried to argue, as if that mountain of debt were some sort of investment in our future together. I laughed. Not a laugh of joy, but a dry, cutting chuckle of disbelief. "For us? Maybe you meant for your mistress, or for your gambling habit, or for those dinners at restaurants I never even knew existed," I replied, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the air between us. The separation was swift, almost painless compared to the months that followed. Edward vanished, as cowards tend to do when the storm they created finally catches up with them. He left behind not only an apartment empty of his presence, but also a financially devastated life that now rested solely on my shoulders. It was then that I realized my upbringing had prepared me for this kind of abandonment. I grew up watching my father, a man more concerned with the appearance of success than with integrity, drag my mother into similar situations. Ever resilient, my mother always rebuilt from scratch, inadvertently teaching me that women like us are destined to clean up the mess left behind by men like him. But unlike her, I decided to break the cycle. The first step was a visit to an attorney specializing in financial fraud cases. "You have a solid case," he told me after meticulously reviewing all the documentation I had compiled. "But prepare yourself for a long battle." Those words, meant to intimidate me, instead became a catalyst. A battle? I had been at war from the moment I realized the extent of the betrayal. I began working overtime at the accounting firm, where I was just an assistant. Recognizing my determination and competence, my boss entrusted me with additional projects that gradually increased my income. At the same time, I leveraged my skills to start a small online financial consulting service, focusing especially on women who had experienced similar situations. "You don't have to be a victim of someone else's financial irresponsibility" became both my marketing slogan and my personal mantra, repeated on nights when the weight of the debt seemed suffocating. Month by month, with every payment made, and every small victory against the system that had once treated me as complicit in Edward's crimes, I felt my strength returning. It wasn't just about settling debts. It was about reclaiming my autonomy and dignity. Renee was essential in this process. My sister, ever cautious and pragmatic, helped me establish a detailed financial recovery plan. "You're not going to fix everything overnight," she reminded me whenever anxiety threatened to take over. "One step at a time, one debt at a time." On the other hand, Sophia provided the emotional support that kept me from succumbing to resentment. "You have every right to be furious," she would say, as we shared a modest bottle of wine on nights of venting. "But don't let that anger consume you. Use it as fuel." Sophia had this remarkable ability to turn destructive emotions into productive strength. We had known each other since high school, and she had witnessed all my failed relationships, including the period when Edward charmed me with his calculated allure and grand promises. Back then, she was the only one who expressed reservations about him. "There's something off in his eyes, Caroline. An ambition that doesn't seem healthy," she warned after our first dinner together. I ignored her warnings, convinced I had found the perfect partner. Now, sitting in my sparsely furnished apartment with bills scattered across the coffee table, I finally understood what she had tried to tell me all those years ago, and I took her advice. I turned every bank rejection into motivation to learn more about my rights. Every threatening call from debt collectors sharpened my negotiation skills. Every penny saved or earned extra became a small victory in the war against the toxic legacy Edward left behind. It was 18 months of relentless work, calculated sacrifices, and meticulously planned strategies. 18 months of packing, my lunch in a Tupperware while co-workers ordered delivery. 18 months of avoiding any non-essential purchase, counting every dollar and turning small savings into significant payments. 18 months of learning to value even the tiniest victories, like successfully negotiating a lower interest rate or landing an extra client for my weekend consulting gigs. 18 months of rediscovering simple, free pleasures, such as taking walks in the park instead of dining out at expensive restaurants, or binge-watching classic movies at home instead of affording weekend getaways. 18 months during which I didn't hear a single word from Edward, as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth, taking only the chaos he'd sown in his wake, and leaving me with the arduous task of rebuilding, until one ordinary Wednesday afternoon, indistinguishable from any other in my new, methodical routine, I received a message that made my stomach drop. "Can we talk? It's urgent. Edward." My first reaction was to ignore it, delete the message and continue with my rebuilt life. But there was something in those simple words that sparked a calculated curiosity about what could be so urgent for someone who had once abandoned me. I replied with a simple when and where, immediately establishing that I wouldn't be the one to travel to meet his needs. We agreed on a meeting at a neutral coffee shop, a public place where I could feel safe and in control. Edward arrived late, as was typical of him. But unlike the confident, always sharply dressed man I once knew, I saw a defeated Edward, with dark circles under his eyes and clothes that betrayed better days. For a brief moment, I felt a twinge of satisfaction at seeing that life hadn't been kind to him either. That feeling was quickly replaced by a measured neutrality. I wasn't there to celebrate his fall, but to hear what he considered so urgent. "You look great," he commented as he sat down, as if trying to start a casual conversation between old friends. "Let's get straight to the point, Edward. What's so urgent?" My voice was firm, devoid of the emotional tremor that had characterized our past encounters. He hesitated, his gaze wandering around the cafe as if searching for the right words. Finally, after a heavy sigh, he began to unravel his story. After leaving me, he had gotten involved in even more dubious ventures, lured by the promise of easy money that could solve his problems. "I thought I could pay off everything I left you with," he explained, as if this belated intention deserved any credit. "And how did that work out for you?" I asked, not hiding the ironic tone in my voice. His eyes avoided mine. "I'm being threatened by dangerous people. I need money to get out of town and start over somewhere else." Of course, the urgency wasn't about fixing the harm he had caused me. It was about saving his own skin. Typical. "How much?" I pressed, keeping my expression impassive. The sum he mentioned, $30,000, was practically an insult considering the $150,000 he'd burdened me with, as if that smaller amount somehow made his request more reasonable, more acceptable. "You're right, Caroline. I have no right to ask for this, but I have nowhere else to turn. I promise I'll pay it back, with interest." Promises. Always promises. Empty words that no longer held any sway over me. You're absolutely right, Edward. You have no right to ask that of me. His eyes revealed genuine desperation. For a moment, I almost wavered. Almost. Then I remembered the countless sleepless nights, the weekends sacrificed, the small joys I had given up in order to rebuild my financial life. When you left me with $150,000 in debt, where did you go? Who helped you while I was left to face the consequences of your actions alone? He had no answers, only flimsy justifications about shame and guilt, about how he couldn't face me knowing what he had done. Let me show you something, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out a meticulously organized folder. Inside were copies of every document that proved the fraud, every payment I had made, every agreement I had negotiated. See this? It's the result of nearly 2 years of hard work to fix the mess you created. Edward flipped through the papers with an expression of shock, as if he were seeing for the first time the true extent of his actions. I'm not showing you this to make you feel guilty. I'm showing it so you understand that while you were busy dodging the consequences, I was here facing each one head on. But these guys, Caroline, they're not playing around. They'll hurt me if I don't pay. His teary eyes searched mine for compassion. In another time, perhaps I would have given in. But the naive Caroline who once allowed herself to be manipulated by male tears was long gone. The answer is, no, Edward. I'm not giving you a single dollar, not out of revenge, but because helping you would only perpetuate the cycle I fought so hard to break. I stood up, ready to close that chapter once and for all. But before leaving, I offered him one final thought. You know what's really ironic? If you had stayed and faced the consequences with me, maybe today we'd be in a completely different situation. Your cowardice didn't just ruin our relationship. It cost you the chance to become a better person. I left that coffee shop feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Not because I was happy about Edward's suffering, but because I had finally freed myself from the power he once held over me. That meeting was the final test. The proof that the ghosts of the past could no longer haunt me. I wandered a few blocks without a destination, simply soaking in the sensation of having definitively closed a painful chapter of my life. The sky was a particularly clear blue that afternoon, with a few scattered clouds forming seemingly significant patterns. I found a small park bench and sat down, watching the bustling city life around me. People in a hurry, each carrying their own untold stories and hidden struggles. How many of them were living situations similar to mine? How many had been betrayed, abandoned, left to deal alone with the consequences of choices that weren't theirs? I took a deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of air filling and leaving my lungs. For the first time in a long time, there was no oppressive weight on my chest. The constant pressure that had compressed my very being ever since I discovered the extent of the debt. It was as if my body finally understood what my mind had already accepted. I was free. Not just free of the debt that was gradually disappearing, but most importantly, free of the need for approval, of the emotional dependency that made me believe I needed someone like Edward to feel complete. 3 weeks later, a mutual friend informed me that Edward had left town, presumably fleeing from his creditors. A part of me worried about his fate. After all, we had spent years together, but a stronger, wiser part knew that his destiny was no longer my responsibility. Today, nearly 5 years after that afternoon at the coffee shop, I can say that the $150,000 debt is completely paid off. More than that, through this painful experience, I developed not only financial skills that propelled me into a thriving career as a consultant, but also a deep understanding of relationships, boundaries, and self-preservation. Sometimes when I share my story with clients in similar situations, I realize that what seemed to be the worst phase of my life turned out to be my greatest strength. Edward's betrayal, which should have destroyed me, ended up being the catalyst for a stronger, more aware, and more complete version of myself. I never wished harm on Edward. In fact, over time, I learned to be grateful for the lesson, not for the abandonment or the debt, but for the opportunity to discover a resilience I never knew I had. Because in the end, the real debt wasn't financial. It was emotional, the price we pay when we let others define our worth. And as for that specific debt, I can now say with satisfaction, I'm completely in the black. Not just financially, but in life. Free from emotional liabilities and rich in self-awareness, investing daily in the one person who will never abandon me, myself. When Edward came back begging for help, I simply showed him the result of my hard work and determination. I didn't need to shout or humiliate him. The truth alone was eloquent enough, and that perhaps was the greatest revenge, proving to him, and especially to myself, that I was perfectly capable of rebuilding what he had tried to destroy. Today, I teach other women to do the same, not to seek revenge, but to find strength where they once saw weakness, to transform debt into an investment in their future, to understand that sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to realize that the climb back up depends solely on our own hands. And if anyone ever asks you what to do when an ex who left you drowning in debt comes back begging for help, tell them to do what I did. Offer knowledge, not cash. Show your journey, not your credit card. Because true help isn't about perpetuating cycles of emotional and financial dependency. It's about inspiring others to break their own chains. My name is Caroline, and my story isn't about a $150,000 debt. It's about the priceless value of discovering that some losses are, in fact, our greatest gains. It's about learning that abandonment, no matter how painful in the moment, can mark the beginning of a journey toward self-discovery. It's about realizing that sometimes you have to lose everything you once thought was important in order to find what truly matters. If I could go back in time and warn that desperate Caroline, crying on the living room floor amidst bank statements and collection notices, I'd say only one thing: hold on tight. What seems like the end is just the beginning of something much better. Because the truth is, even in the darkest moments, when the pain felt unbearable and the future completely uncertain, there was a strength inside me that refused to give up. And perhaps that is the most valuable lesson of all: discovering that we are far stronger, far more capable, and far more resilient than we ever imagined. That we can survive betrayal, abandonment, crushing debt, and sleepless nights. That we can not only survive, but thrive, grow, and transform into better versions of ourselves. So if you're going through something similar, feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders and the sense that you'll never recover, remember my story. Remember that one day you'll look back and realize that what once felt like your end was merely the painful, necessary, and transformative beginning of a much more authentic and fulfilling life.